as we begin this next session, we have Dr. Varghese Phillip with us. He is the chairman of EMFI presently. He did his medicine and his master's in surgery from CMC Vellore, and he and his wife, Dr. Nirmala, were part of the founding team which went to establish the hospital at Asha Kiran in Lamtaput in Orissa. We will be having a presentation from that hospital this evening. It is a joy for us to have you, sir, with us. Dr. Varghese Phillip was also previously the executive director of Emmanuel Hospital Association, and he also worked with Mission Aviation Federation. He is the author of the book On the Wings of the Dawn, on a book on medical missions. And so we welcome you, sir, to this time. And Dr. Varghese Phillip will be sharing on the biblical perspective of missions. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Jacob. Let me share the screen. Is that seen?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir, it's seen.
Thank you. Good morning, friends. It's a real joy to be with you this morning, especially for this Pachalur conference. Pachalur has been a very important place in all our hearts. Many have heard God's call in Pachalur and have gone into some of the remote places in this country. So it's a very sacred place where people hear God's call. So this morning, I want to talk about the God who calls. As you can see, the emphasis is on the God who calls, because He is the one who calls. He calls the entire creation. He calls everyone, everything that is there, everything that we can see. But He calls humans in a special way because we are made in the image of God. So for us, communication is possible with God because we are made in His image. This is a different type of communication from what happens with other creation that is all around us. He has made humans with that ability to hear the call of God. We can refuse to hear Him. We can walk away. We can shut the door on His face. But to hear the call of God is one of the most important faculties that God has given us. Apart from the ears, He has given us the intelligence, the faculty to perceive, insight, wisdom, all that to hear what He has to tell us. So I want to focus today's message on the book of Genesis, because Genesis is the first book and it brings everything into newness. Everything new is made in the book of Genesis, and that starts with the call of God. So book of Genesis is actually about God calling His creation and His people.
Excuse me, Dr.
So, yes. So I want to look at, before we go into the book, I want to look at two terms that need definition. One is, what is call? There are three ways of understanding call, and there are different ways to define it. So one way is when Say, when our daughter was born, we gave her a name. And that is how we call her, by her name, the name that we gave her. And that name also indicates our aspirations for her, what we want her to become. So when God calls, He is giving us an identity and also giving us a purpose. And the second aspect of the call is that it's a relationship. Like, for example, when I call someone, a friend, or someone, even a stranger, what I'm trying to say is, I want to communicate with you. I want to share my story with you. I want to share my life with you, or I want to share an incident with you. Or when we were children, we would say, I want to share a secret with you. So it is a way of establishing a relationship. And thirdly, it is an invitation to a relationship. Like, for example, I invite my friend to come for a meal, to have a meal with us. That is an invitation to experience a meal with us, invitation to experience a blessing. So these three are different aspects of the call that is embedded in the call of God. That He calls us by name. He gives us an identity, and with that identity comes the purpose. And He calls us into a relationship with Him, and He calls us and invites us to an experience with Him. Now, the second term is the uh, term called blessing, and this is very closely linked with the word call. Blessing in Hebrew is barak. You may have heard of Barack Obama, which is the same derivative. Arabic also, it means the same thing, which is the blessing. Blessing is God's benevolence towards His creation. It is His goodness towards His creation. The first time we see this use in Genesis chapter 1, verses 22, where God blessed them, that is the animals, and said, "Be fruitful and multiply." And again in verse 22, He blesses human beings and says, "Be fruitful and multiply and subdue the earth and rule over everything." So God's blessing in that context is actually the enablement for us to do what we are created for. It is the power that is given to us to do what God has created us for. Now, again, we see in Genesis chapter 12, verse 1 to 3. Let me read that portion for you. It is the foundational verse for us today. And it reads like this. Now the Lord said to Abraham, "Go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great. And so you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse. And in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed." If you notice, just in verses 2 and 3, 5 times the word blessing comes in different forms. Bless, blessing, and blessed. So it's a very important term that God uses to indicate His provision for us. The land, the descendants, and and goodness that can happen to the nations around. So the second aspect of blessing is the provision that God makes. And the third aspect is mentioned in Genesis chapter 15, verse 1, and it says, um, this is the same call of God reiterated again in chapter 15 to Abraham, and it says, "Do not fear, Abraham, I am your shield and your very great reward." I am your very great reward. The ultimate reward is his presence with us. So these three aspects are very important. And in the presence, we see in Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew begins and ends with presence, with God's presence. Matthew 1, where the birth of Jesus is foretold, it says, Emmanuel, God with us. And towards the end of Matthew, Jesus says, I'll be with you till the end of the world. So Matthew's gospel begins and ends with, um, with the presence of God. So this is perhaps the most important aspect of the blessing that we have, apart from enablement or power and provision that we get from God as a blessing. It is the presence that is the most enduring aspect. Yeah, thank you. So the second aspect of blessing is the human response. Second meaning of blessing is the human response, and that is to kneel in worship. So like for example, Noah, after he comes out of the flood, he establishes his land and garden and everything. Then he blesses God. That is, he kneels in worship to God in thankfulness and trust. And the most significant meaning we find in Eliezer. You remember in chapter 24 of Genesis, Abraham sends his servant Eliezer to look for a bride for his son Isaac. And when Eliezer reaches the well, he finds Rebecca coming to draw water. And when he finds out who she is, he is so excited, he is so thrilled, and he says, "Blessed be the Lord," because at that point he knew that God, who blessed Abraham, has given that blessing to God had blessed Abraham with a bride for his son, so that he will have descendants to go on with that line. So he knelt in blessing to God. So kneeling in worship is another aspect of blessing. That is our human response to what God does towards us. So blessing is from God towards us is threefold. One is power to do what we are created for. Secondly, provision. And thirdly, presence. And as I said, presence is the most important aspect of the blessing that we have. Next slide, please. So here I have indicated in a diagrammatic form what the blessing is. On one side, we have, no, the previous. We have blessing. God gives his presence as his blessing to humans, and in response, we worship. We kneel in worship. Worship actually means not just singing songs and putting up your hands and doing what we normally do in church, but it's actually to surrender our lives, to trust God for what he has done towards us, what he has provided for us, that is his presence. So this is the summary of blessing that comes through in the Bible. Next slide, please. We look at 4 different dimensions of the call. These are different dimensions, not just the 4 ways in which God calls. It is the way in which God called these particular people in Genesis. God may call us differently. Each one receives God's call differently. But what we are going to look at is the nature of God who calls. So Genesis can be easily divided into 4 main sections. One is Genesis 1 to 11, which talks about the creation. And it is the story of creation and so on. And many theologians call it as the prehistory because there are no identifiable landmarks or timeline that we see there. And second portion is Genesis 12 to 25, which is the story of Abraham and how Abraham is called. Then next portion is Genesis 25 to 36, where we predominantly see the story of Jacob. And here, and then we see Genesis 37 to 50 is the story of Joseph. In all 4, we see God calling each one in different ways. In the first section, God calls the creation as the creator. In the second section, we see God calling Abraham as a promise keeper, promise giver and a promise keeper. And in the third aspect, he calls Jacob as his pursuer. And in the fourth section, we see Joseph being called by the dream giver. Dream giver calls Joseph. In each of these, as I said, it is a different way in which God calls. It is a different way in which God's call is received and responded to. Each of them respond differently to God's call. And each one goes through the tension between faith and unfaith. Each one goes through the tension of staying true to the call of God versus falling away, versus slipping up. Each one goes through the tension of the reality of God versus the reality of the world. It is much like what we go through when we decide to obey God. So in many senses, they are like very much like us, humans with human weaknesses. But how they respond to God's call is a great message for us about the God who calls. Next slide. Next one. Yeah. Now, the first section deals with the general call. That is the creation. It applies to everyone. It applies to us, all of us. And then we look at the specific calls. We hope to go through all 4 calls today and tomorrow and see what we can learn about God. Next slide. Now, the first is about the Creator calls the creation. This is the most fundamental relationship, Creator and creation. There can be no more fundamental relationship than the Creator and the creation. All other relationships are built on this basic relationship. All other relationships are subordinated to this relationship. Because Creator has created the universe, he stays engaged with the universe, with his creation. He has not abandoned the creation, much like what many people would say. especially atheists would say, looking at all the things that are happening in the world, the chaos, the war and the violence and all that, they would say God has created the universe and left it, and we don't know where he is now. Or some atheists would say it's like a watchmaker who has made the watch, wound it up and left it. It's on auto run, it's on auto mode. And when the battery runs out or when the spring uncoils, it comes to an end. It is not like that. Creator stays engaged with the creation, but he does not force the creation to obey. He respects the creation. And so, what is the purpose and the call of the creation? We see that most clearly in Ephesians chapter 1, verse 9 to 11. If you can turn to Ephesians chapter 1, verses 9 to 11, it's one of the most beautiful and summarized version of the purpose of all creation. And it is the best expression of our overall call. What is God calling us as his creation? And it says like this, and he made known to us the mystery of his will according to his good pleasure. And what is that mystery which he purposed in Christ to be put into effect when times will have reached their fulfillment? And the mystery is this, to bring all things in heaven and on earth together under one head, even Christ. All things together in heaven and on earth, together under one head, even in Christ. So that is the purpose of creation. It is unification of everything. You see chaos, you see fragmentation in everything that we see. But the purpose of the Creator is to bring everything into order, into the headship of Christ. So unity is what is indicated here, bring everything together under the headship of Christ. So there are two aspects to the unity. In the creation story itself, we find one meaning of unity, and that is in Genesis chapter 1, verse 31. When God created everything, he said, he looked at it and said, it was very good. The beauty, the order, and the organization at that point, everything was together, everything was in order, everything was in harmony, everything was in the right place where it should be. That is one aspect of unity. The other is what is clearly seen here, and that is to sum up everything in Christ. To bring all things in heaven, in some translations it says as to sum up everything under Christ. In Greek, Paul uses the term, which is a mathematical word for it, to sum up. That is, you have many numbers, and at the end, you add everything together and you come out with one number. That is to sum up all those numbers. That is the meaning here. Everything is added into one, into a whole. And that is what is meant by bringing everything together. So ultimately, it is a response to the fall, response to our own rebellion and fragmentation that is intended as the purpose of creation, as the call of God to bring everything together. Next slide, please. How do I respond? I respond with faithful obedience. I respond by saying, yes, I want to be part of this call of God, to bring unity, to bring everything under the unity under Christ. And our role is to bring beauty and order. We need to be unifiers, not fragmenters. We need to create unity where there is fragmentation. We need to bring people together where people hate each other. We need to be peacemakers where there is no peace. We need to bring peace where there is war. We need to bring harmony where there is disharmony. That is our role in creation. And the third aspect is unifying all people, nations, tribes, and languages under the headship of Christ. That is the great mission mandate that God has given us, to bring everything together under the unifying headship of Christ. We look at one example, next slide please, of William Carey. William Carey was a shoemaker. You may have heard of his name. He was from England. He was a shoemaker, and he liked to call himself as the cobbler. He had a great talent for learning languages. In England itself, he had learned 5 different languages: Greek and Hebrew and many other European languages. And he got converted, and he was pastoring a church where he felt God was calling him to be a missionary in India. So after talking and meeting and raising his support to start his missionary work in India, he arrived in Calcutta and established a university called Serampore University. And because he had a great talent for learning languages, he learned Sanskrit. He felt if he needed to reach to the Hindus, he needed to learn Sanskrit. Then he learned Bengali. He learned Marathi. And he became a professor of all 3, Sanskrit, Bengali, and Marathi. He was so fluent in these 3 languages. He became a professor. Then he translated Bible into 24 different languages. Many of these main languages that we have Bible in are actually originally translated by William Carey. And he published the first newspaper in India. And he fought to end sati, where the widow is burnt at stakes after her husband dies. He fought to end that practice in India. He fought to end female infanticide. So he was a reformer in many senses. So what he was trying to do was bring all creation under the headship of Christ. Bring order where there is disorder. Where there is violence, trying to bring harmony and peace. Where there is no beauty, bring beauty and harmony. I would really recommend you to read Vishal Mangalwadi's biography of William Carey. It's a very well written biography of William Carey. Please do read it if you can get hold of a book. So his first newspaper that he started became the seed for us to fight for our independence in India. It became a unifying voice for us Indians to talk about freedom. So he catalyzed many of these social changes that we see today, the effect of it. So he was trying to bring everything together under one headship. So this is our mandate as when the Creator calls all of us to be unifiers, to bring everything into order, to bring everything under the headship of Christ. That is the greatest mandate that we have. Next slide. The second aspect of the call, second dimension of the call is to Abraham. To Abraham, God appears as a promise keeper, promise giver, and a promise keeper. It is the promise keeper who calls Abraham. If you look at the first part of the Genesis, chapter 1 to 11, we see that it ends with a negative note. We see Tower of Babel, men making the Tower of Babel to reach up to heaven, to reach God. It represents human effort to reach God, but God scatters the people across the earth. But God hasn't given up on creation. He remains committed to the creation. So now the call comes to Abraham. He chooses Abraham and calls him. And primarily the call is to depart. As you can see in the first verse of chapter 12, it says, I'm reading from Alter's version, it says, and the Lord said to Abram, go forth from your land and your birthplace and your father's house to the land I will show you. So this is the primary nature of the call, and that is the call is to depart. Here you can see in that verse, 3 times the emphasis is made. Go forth from your land, your birthplace, and your father's house. Each time it is getting closer and closer to Abraham's heart. From your land, your birthplace, and your father's house. It is touching Abraham where it matters most. And he says, depart. And the next time we hear God calling Abraham to depart is when God says, asks him to go and sacrifice Isaac. We see that in Genesis 22, verse 2, where it says, take, pray, your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go forth to the land of Moriah. Again, that 3 emphasis. Your son, your only son, whom you love. How close it gets to Abraham's heart. And it's emphasized that it is a definitive departure for Abraham from all that he holds dear. And as you can see, life must be lived between these 2 departures. Abraham had to live his life between these 2 departures, departure at the beginning and towards the end of his faith life. And between these 2 departures, there are many instances of unfaith where Abraham falters in his faith. Abraham forgets who the promise keeper is. Abraham stumbles, but at these critical moments, when these 2 call comes to Abraham to depart, he really obeys and departs. So when the New Testament authors look back at the life of Abraham, they don't look at so much his stumbling and his ways in which he has faltered, but they look at his way he has obeyed, and that becomes a righteousness for him. Next slide, please. So the call is, as I said, is to depart. It is a radical call. That is the primary call of God, that is to depart. And I want to define that word radical. Radical means, you may have heard it in chemistry, it is that primary element. It is the element around which other things are built. It is the root. It is the cornerstone. It is the foundation stone on which everything else is built. So it is the basic ingredient of call. It is the root of the call, and that is to depart. And what it does, what departure does, is gives us an opportunity for a new beginning. It gives us an opportunity to lay aside our old life and go into a new life. It gives us an opportunity from our old relationships that are pulling us down into a new set of relationships. It gives us an opportunity from taking control of our own lives into placing ourselves into the hands of God. It gives us an opportunity to leave behind our old priorities to a set of new priorities. It gives us an opportunity to leave behind our old desires and addictions into a new set of desires. That is what God's call to departure will do to us. Newness. It brings us something new into our life. And placing ourselves into God's hands is something of great value to us, because so far we ran our lives. We ran it according to what we thought was the best option. In the newness, as we place our life into the hands of God for Him to guide and lead, we find that He leads us to places and relationships and desires that will uh, scale new heights, that will open up new doors into new vistas and new worlds of opportunity. But in this departure, are there dilemmas? Sure, there are dilemmas and doubts. And that is what Abraham's life teaches us. And we'll look at a couple of dilemmas that Abraham faced. Next one. So if you look at uh, Abraham's life, call comes to Abraham in chapter 12. But before that, call comes to before that in chapter 11, verse 30. It says, now Sarai was barren. She had no children. That is how the story of Abraham begins in chapter 11 towards the end. So the context of the call is barrenness. But incredible promises made in both chapter 12 and chapter 15 we see. There are two primary promises that are made, and that is of land and of descendants. And as we see, there are contradictions. What are the contradictions? One is that Sarah is barren. That is the context of the promise. And then Abraham himself is 75 years old. And in this promise that God makes, Abraham encounters two dilemmas that he could not reconcile, that cannot be reconciled. God promises land to him while he is a nomad. Land is occupied by other nations and he is a foreigner. He is asked to go into a foreign land, but that land is promised to him. But then land is occupied by somebody else. And second is, both he and Sarai are too old to have children. And God promises their own child as the carrier of promise, as the carrier of blessing to the next generation. So the contradiction is that land is useless if he does not have descendants to own it. Because what is the use of land when they both die without children and the land goes to somebody else? And the promise of children is useless if there is no land, because his children will be scattered all over the place. So, inbuilt in God's promise are the contradictions that we cannot seem to reconcile in the reality of our experience. That is how God's promises are. There are contradictions. It, it doesn't correspond with the reality of our experience. And as you can see, Sarah could not contain her cynicism when angel tells Abraham that she will have a child. She laughs out loud. And God replies with the most important question that we need to ask ourselves. Is there anything too hard for the Lord? Is there anything too hard for the Lord? When we find contradictions in God's call, this is the question that we need to ask. When we find irreconcilable contradictions when God calls us, when we find that there are questions of need, there are questions of PG, there are questions of money, there are questions of house, there are questions of parents, and there is a question of God's call. It cannot be reconciled. And we need to sincerely ask God, is there anything too hard for the Lord? And then move on in our faith life. Now, all this is compounded many more times when God gives a child in their old age, a miracle child, to Sarah and Abraham, and God says, now go and sacrifice him. How can Abraham reconcile that? It is God who promised a child, and now God says, go and sacrifice that child. Without that child, the land is useless. The blessing of God is null and void. What is he to do? How did he respond? I'm sure he asked that critical question that God asked him. Is there anything too hard for the Lord? And that's what we see in Hebrews 11, when the author of Hebrews looks at that incident and he says, Abraham thought, in answer to that question, he thought, God is able to give back Isaac even after he sacrificed him. God is capable. God is able to do that. And he trusted him. And he trusted him and obeyed him. So the promise keeper promises, dilemmas persist, but it's the dilemmas that shape us, dilemmas that shape our faith life. And we always need to ask this question, is there anything too hard for the Lord? And move on in our faith life. Next slide, please. So, what is the lifestyle of the called? In Hebrews chapter 11, let's look at a few verses. Please turn to Hebrews chapter 11, verse 8 to 10. By faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith, he lived as an alien in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise. For he was looking for a city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. Did you notice Abraham obeyed and went to a place that he is to receive as an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where. And then it says, by faith, he lived as an alien in the land of promise. He lived as an alien in the land of promise. We would have thought in a land of promise, okay, we'll say, okay, God has promised me this land, now I'm going to build a palace for myself. No, Abraham lived as an alien in the land of promise, as in a foreign land. How do we live in a foreign land? We don't buy houses, we rent houses, or we live in tents. And Abraham dwelt in tents with Isaac and Jacob, all his descendants, with the blessing that God had promised him. And he was looking for another city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. He was living as an alien. He was living in tents in the very land of promise that God had made to him. And he was looking for another city. It shows us that lifestyle of the call is the lifestyle of a pilgrim, where no settlement is possible. It is an attitude of constantly moving as God moves. It is an attitude of saying, this is not the place for me. This is not the place that I settle down. This is not my permanent place. I have another permanent place. So, which means that our priorities are turned upside down. What we go after in life is turned upside down. We won't be going after what everybody goes after. Everybody wants to settle down and build houses and do all that. But that is not what we are called to do. We are called to be pilgrims. And the next attitude is that uh, it the call precipitates a crisis. Have you experienced that? God's call certainly will precipitate a crisis for you if you choose to obey God. In Mark chapter 8, verses 34 to 38, it reads like this. And he summoned a crowd with his disciples and said to them, if anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? For what will a man give in exchange for his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will also be ashamed of him when he comes in the glory of his Father with his holy angels. So following Christ precipitates a crisis because of the choices that you are called upon to make. It is not like the choices that everybody else makes. So you have the peer pressure, you have the family pressure, you have the societal pressure because you have chosen to obey Christ and followed a different set of priorities. And the crisis is also because what you have to give up. And that is a crisis that you have to deal with. And as I said, the presence of God, the most abiding blessing that we can ever experience, will be with you as you obey the call of God. And that is the most treasured possession that we can have, that is to have God with us. I want to end with two stories. Next slide, please. This is Dr. Edward Galt of Vellore. Edward Galt was trained as a surgeon in Australia. He and his wife, both doctors, felt called to work in India because his sister had gone to India as a missionary. And they worked in Azamgarh Mission Hospital, and he was the medical superintendent there. At that time, in the 1940s, Ida Skada was establishing the Christian Medical College in Vellore. She was increasing the medical seats and taking men students, and there were plans to expand the medical college. So she asked Dr. Galt whether he could please be the pathologist and start the pathology department. He was a surgeon. He was an accomplished surgeon doing great many things and helping many people in Azamgarh. But he obeyed Ida Skada. So he accepted the call to be a pathologist, went back to Australia, learned pathology, and came back as the first head of pathology and CMC. He established one of the largest path specimen labs in Asia. He also established the Indian Association of Pathologists and became its first president. He did some pioneering research in leprosy with Paul Brand and started the movement towards understanding leprosy much more so that they could help patients with that severe disability. So imagine here a surgeon working in a mission hospital as a medical superintendent, doing great things. God calls him to depart and do something new. And imagine a surgeon becoming a pathologist to change his specialty completely for the sake of meeting a need, for the sake of obeying God. And he obeyed like Abraham. And he went forth and established Vellore. And that became a blessing for so many people where he trained pathologists and students and doctors for so many years. Next, I want to talk about Hudson Taylor of China. Hudson Taylor was doing medicine in England. He was a medical student. At the age of 21, while he was still doing medicine, he felt a strong conviction that God was calling him to be a missionary to China. So he left his medical studies midway and traveled by ship for 6 months to China and reached there and did a survey and felt that he needs to go into the interiors of China. You can see those rivers, small rivers into the interiors. He traveled by those rivers. So he came back, finished his studies, raised support, raised missionaries, and went back to China to found China Interior Mission, which became at that point one of the largest mission organizations with hundreds of missionaries. He was able to inspire and recruit many hundreds. And many, at that time, revolution was going on in China, early 1800s, late 1700s. And many were killed, martyred in China. And he himself died in China, and his tomb is still there in China. So here is a person who felt the call of God, who departed whatever was comfortable. He could have been a very great doctor in England, made lots of money, but nobody would have heard his name today. Today, people see him as one of the foremost missionaries of that era. And he impacted hundreds of lives. Even today, the churches that he established remain as a beacon of light in that very oppressive country of China. That is what he accomplished in uniting people from different parts of the world into the headship of Christ. That is what God is calling you today. And I'll end with his quote: God's work done in God's way will never lack God's supplies. That is what we have experienced as we obeyed God. And we experienced God's provision, God providing people, God providing resources, God providing all that we need, God taking care of our children. As we obeyed God, He will never lack His supplies, His blessing upon us. More than anything else, it is the presence of God that enlightens us, that gives us new hope, new meaning, and new purpose in our life. May God bless you.